Hi there, my name is Mathew, and today I'm going to be showing off the Looptrotter SA2RATE that is being recently emulated by Brainworx and Plugin Alliance. I'm going to be making a few videos here and there of some of my favourite plugins that I use, and also some new plugins, and maybe some like production tutorials or mixing, mastering tutorials and whatnot. And yeah, so let's sort of jump into things. So we've got the Looptrotter here. And we also have a track that I've been working on. So I just want to sort of jump straight in really. So I've already processed the master bus with this plugin, and I want to kind of A/B kind of before and after, just to kind of give you a demonstration of how well the plugin sort of enhances the mix essentially. So you'll notice that there's a bit of an amplitude difference, and so that kind of makes things perceptually better anyway. But you'll notice that the plugin almost makes things sound a bit more three-dimensional and a little bit wider, and almost a little bit more in your face, which is something that you kind of want to achieve a little bit here and there with particularly like electronic dance music, or most genres in fact. But yeah, so we have the Looptrotter here. The plugin comes in as a VST as well as an audio unit, and I believe it comes as like an RTAS or AAX or whichever the guys on Pro Tools use. And yeah, so we have the plugin here, and we have these three sort of rack units, if you like, and essentially the analog hardware is just this top piece. This second bit is more so something that is unique to the software version, because you have your sort of metering here, your output, and you also have gain compensation, which is something that I think is a first for a Brainworx plugin. So with the gain compensation, I think if we turn this to 2, you can see that on these input-output levels, they are both almost perfectly matched. With the gain compensation off, however, you can see that there is a bit of an increase on our output level, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but for the sake of like comparison, it's kind of difficult to tell exactly what the plugin is actually doing if we have some amplitude differences. So with the plugin on and gain compensated, the first thing you can notice really is the fact that the plugin makes everything sound very wide, and just wide and almost quite luscious. And so if we kind of dive into the plugin a little bit and just kind of go through exactly what settings I have on this master, I can then after that show you kind of processing something from scratch. So on the top we have our drive control. This is pretty self-explanatory. So if I turn up the mix here, so you can hear that you can really drive something, or you can just be quite gentle and lightly dust some saturation on a track, which makes this plugin quite versatile to use, which is, again, it's very useful. This process switch is kind of like just a bypass really. As you can hear, it's independent of the sort of magic mix and THD controls. So the next section we have our THD control, and it kind of ties in with this drive control here. So when we drive the unit, it's essentially adding THD, or total harmonic distortion, which is essentially just saturation. Now low safe kind of just shaves the saturation off from the low end. So if I process it a bit harshly, it kind of allows more of the unprocessed low end through, and it kind of just allows you to have a bit more clarity on process parts that are particularly heavy on the sub. So this will be good when processing bass like we have here, or when we're processing like a kick drum or anything like that. We then have this high smooth control, sorry. Now again, if we process quite harshly, you can hear that when engaged, the high end just sounds a little less abrasive. Which again is very useful, and this is useful for possibly tracks that are already quite harsh, so maybe like an acoustic guitar that feels a bit bright, but you kind of want this plugin to add more sort of low mid warmth rather than high sort of saturation. And it's also good for the fact that when we're processing the master, we're not making the high end any harsher than it already is, which can help, especially if you're doing any harsh EQing on the master itself. But you can hear that when we're just going up towards the 4% drive. The difference that the low safe and high smooth controls make is quite negligible. Now we do have like kilohertz control here, so we can kind of say when this should start taking effect. So this high smooth will take effect from about 12 kilohertz and upwards. I've noticed I think that's an error there. That should say kilohertz and not hertz on the label. But anyway, on this low safe it's set to 50 by default. We can raise this and lower as desired, which again can be very useful, particularly when processing something quite harshly. So after this we have our mix control, which is self-explanatory. It just allows us to do parallel processing, just so we can kind of process harshly and kind of blend that in, which can give us some sort of different effects essentially. We then have this magic control. I'm not too sure exactly what this does. I'm sure if I can open up the manual I can tell you, but obviously we can all look at the manual ourselves. But just by listening, it almost sounds like the harmonics are being boosted, and this is a little bit like the SPL Twin Tube. So this is another plugin by Plugin Alliance and Brainworx, in association with SPL. So this plugin is being a bit harsh, so saturate off. You can hear that increase in harmonics. They've both got similar effects. I think the SPL feels a little bit on the bright side, and the Looptrotter feels a little bit more tamed and a little bit more focused on the I'd say sort of like upper mids and like sort of lower down on the highs, which is nice because usually when saturating we're also making the low end and like the mid sound good rather than the sort of extreme high end. So that's very helpful. We then have these controls essentially replicated. And now this is for the mid and side. We can also change this, and I think this is how it opens by default, so we can have as a left and right control as well. Both these sets of controls can be linked, so we can see that we've linked them, or unlinked, so we can kind of process things separately, which is more so beneficial for doing mid-side processing. We have a power on off switch, which is just replicating this on off switch here. This gain compensation feature, again, it just allows us to make sure the level is identical going in and out, so we can kind of compare things and sort of hear exactly what the plugin is doing. The output control, again, self-explanatory. We have TMT, which we see on all the Brainworx stuff these days, and it just essentially models some of the tolerances of the mid and side or left and right channel separately, so that we can get, so for example, 50% on the mid and 50% on the side is never going to be exactly the same, which kind of replicates what happens with analog hardware. If you have two of both like controls that's the same, they're never actually going to be the same. And so this is beneficial because if we have like more so for like channel strips. If we have loads of channel strips, we can kind of employ the tolerance modeling, sorry, and yeah, and this can kind of make things sound a bit varied and not so static, which can kind of give you more of a 3D sort of effect. We then have this density control. And this is quite a common control to have in saturation plugins and whatnot. Sometimes this might be known as like a headroom control. For example, if it's a compressor plugin, usually it's known as a headroom control rather than density. I think the black box plugin by, I don't know where that is gone. Where is it? No, I can't see it. But yeah, the black box has the same density control. We then have the mono maker, which makes sure essentially when going to the output, it makes sure that whatever is in your low end or wherever below this defined threshold is in mono only, and there's no stereo signal. So what we can do is we can process mid and side. We can process side, kind of slam it if you want. We can then mono make it, so essentially the only thing that's getting let through in the output is the mid processing. We can then do some stereo widening as well. You can already hear that it just sounds wide and just nice, essentially. Yeah, and so that's kind of basically the plugin in all of its glory. We do have some extra controls, obviously, as we have like an undo, redo. We have essentially 4 instances of the plugin within one window, so we can compare 4 different settings. We can do copy and paste between these. We can also reset the essentially the setting we're on to kind of the default. We then have an input control. We also have a solo mid and solo side control, which allows us to kind of just focus on what's exactly going on the sides and what's going on in the mids. Strangely, I think that when it's in left and right modes, maybe we should be able to do this with the left and right channel. So, well, I don't know if that would be beneficial. I don't know if it's more beneficial just to have mid and side processing. We have this button up here, so we can kind of remove the Brainworx section, so we can kind of just focus on the plugin itself, as there was the actual hardware that, of course, wouldn't have this Brainworx section. But yeah, I don't know why you'd usually want that off, because these settings down here can be quite useful. Now this track, if I change it to mid side, obviously has this applied to the master, but I also have this applied to the bass instrument. Now you can hear that the effect of this plugin is quite subtle, and you might not hear the effect unless you're on headphones or somewhat decent monitoring. So you can hear that it kind of just thickens things up, and I'm going to go on this B setting just so we can kind of go through from scratch and just kind of see the sort of workflow of this saturator. So you can hear that already. It's kind of doing something without touching anything. And of course TMT has a part to play, and that's going to make things sound a little bit wider. Now usually when doing saturation I like to use mid-side processing more so than the left and right. And that's kind of like with any sort of processing where you can choose between left and right and mid-side. And that's because, you know, having fine control over the mids separate of the side channels, you can kind of just get a better representation in mono. So usually on my master I have this mono check, which is essentially just a utility that has a key command that engages the mono, or engages the plugin that's just already set to mono. So for example, if you play the entire track, yeah, so I can basically just kind of mono the whole thing and just sort of kind of just see how things go. Yeah, so when we look at the mid and side, generally, of course, we want to unlink the channels and sort of process separately. So what we can do here, we can focus on the mid, and it's always good to check the sides because I don't think this bass has any stereo information, from what I can remember anyway. If I can find the bass here. Yeah, so you can see that there is no stereo information. So which at this point we're kind of just only concerned with this mid section, so channel linking won't make a difference. Now the problem is that if we have this in left and right mode and the TMT engaged, we're going to vary the left and right channel just ever so slightly, which might cause some phasing issues. Again, with my little key command on the master, I can kind of check for that. So you can kind of hear that in the analog mode, it kind of just smears things just a touch, and it's very almost basically inaudible, but it is there. So usually when I'm working on mono material, of course we want to keep it in digital mode. Or if you have a mono instance of the plugin, then that's usually ideal. So I want to kind of just like beef up the bass essentially and just kind of not have it feel obtrusive, but still a little bit more energetic than usual. So I might process quite harshly and just do some parallel processing, see where that gets us. So now you can hear that between the two settings we have very different sounds. So B feels a little bit more squashed and a little bit more driven, whereas, well, I guess it's because the drive is quite low on A. It doesn't feel so quite processed. Now what we can do is, for example, if we say, okay, we prefer the processing of A, we can then play with the density. Or for example, because B feels quite squashed and quite dense, you can see that by lowering the density, it kind of makes things sound a lot more dynamic and sort of less squashed dynamically. And now you can hear that the effect of this plugin is quite subtle, and it kind of just tickles the source material, if you like. And so it's I don't think this plugin is designed so much for creating like aggressive guitar sounds. But certainly you can probably get really good sort of aggressive tones. So yeah, so you can process bass pretty well with it. I don't know if there's any other instruments, so I might try and have a look at the kick. I don't know if I've no, so I haven't processed with that yet. So If we go to the Looptrotter. You can hear that with the low safe off. It kind of does too much to the low end, and it kind of just makes it all just a bit too crunchy. But with low safe on, we get the cleanness of the low end from the original signal, but we then get a bit more crunchiness in the sort of mids. Now, because we're processing the kick and it's just a mono signal essentially, we don't want to process with TMT, so we'll turn that off. And you can hear again that the effect of the plugin is again really sort of subtle. But I think it's nice that the plugin kind of pushes things a bit forward in the mix. So like, as you can hear when the whole mix is playing, the kick isn't very audible. It sounds quite, I suppose, subby, and you've got the little click at the beginning. But with this plugin engaged, we get a bit more information in the mids. And again, going to the master, if we kind of do this from scratch and go to mid-side, unlink, keep the TMT engaged, maybe we can go to a different setting. We can solo the mids. Now the idea here is we want to kind of get a little bite, but we don't want to be too heavy. And so this is typically a case where we would do a lot of parallel processing. And you can hear that just in the middle channel. It adds a lot of warmth. And you notice that it doesn't smear the highs or the lows, which is often the case with a lot of saturation plugins, which is really nice. We can then go to the side channel. Because there's no heavy low-end information, I might leave the low safe off, just because, yeah, the plugin's not getting rammed by low-end, so we don't have to worry about that. Now, when doing parallel processing, I like to just kind of sometimes shut my eyes and just kind of like fiddle with the mix and just kind of use my ears and really just see what sounds best and just kind of just fine tune until we get a setting that sounds right. Yeah, so about 30%. Sounds quite good. Now we can take off solo side, sorry. And you can hear already how better the song sounds. Now, when listening as a whole, I feel like the processing on the mids is a little bit too much. And I'm still sort of feeling like the saturation feels quite dense still. So we can go to this density knob. And we can sort of retain the feeling of the processing, but we can just reduce how sort of thick and sort of creamy the saturation feels. We can also go the other way if we like. But by sort of going to like towards minus 100%, we kind of bring back some of the dynamics. And as we know from saturation plugins, it's often the case that when you saturate or overdrive, it's kind of achieving a similar effect to sort of like a limiter or a compressor. And so the density kind of allows us to kind of mitigate that if we want to. Now, because it's this is the master. We can use the mono maker and stereo width to kind of just tweak things a little bit, just kind of make sure the signal's in mono. So usually I'll put it around 80 hertz. Maybe even a touch lower. And as a good tip, it's always good to take in mind that you can have some side information in your sort of subs, just as long as it's not, it's not sort of like the main thing. If we do a little mono check, we can see that when stereo widening, this is being applied to the subs, and you can hear that. When we go quite extreme, in particular, you can hear that there's some weirdness going on. So by using mono maker, we can kind of avoid that in the low end, but we can still get the width on the mids and highs. So if I take off my mono, kind of tailor things. And then generally with limiting, it's good to have like sort of up to about -3 gain reduction. Of course you might have the odd peak that goes above, but on average make sure you sort of peak into that -3 gain reduction. Mainly because I find that's kind of like a sweet spot. We can put on oversampling, but I won't do that because the obviously my CPU will get destroyed. So yeah. So that's the Looptrotter, and yeah, and I think it's my next favourite saturation plugin, if I'm honest. It will definitely be appearing on like my master buses or mix buses, sorry, a lot more often than even I'd apply that sort of like the Decapitator or the VSM2 plugin or whatnot. I think it really is unique in that it's quite subtle, but you can get a really good effect. You can kind of make things sound quite sort of three-dimensional, or you might want to say analog. But yeah, I mean, you can buy this now. I'm not too sure what the price is. I know, if you've already been a customer, I'm sure there's some sort of loyalty discount or whatnot. I know the subscription bundles, it's added for free. So if you're already subscribed, you should be able to just install this. And yeah, so this is the Looptrotter SA2RATE, and I think it's probably the best saturation plugin. And yeah, I'll see you in the next video.